Hello, welcome again to the Fhtf Rhtr podcast, forgetting how to forget and remembering how to remember. There's something called a gentleman's agreement. It refers to a contract between two people that doesn't need to be in writing, that doesn't need witnesses, and surely doesn't need a law court to find out what the intricacies of the contract may be. All that is needed in a gentleman's contract is the honor of both people and their reputations that they will honor the contract and make sure that they hold their ends of the bargain. Generally, they discourage people from having this kind of agreements because when you cannot enforce an agreement or when you can't even find an agreement, that puts you in a terrible position should things go south. But that's the whole idea of a gentleman's contract, that things will not go south. When these agreements work out well, when people agree to be bound by gentleman's agreements, they become even stronger than what the law enforces. It can create dynasties, but when they don't work well, when a gentleman's agreement does not work well, it can destroy empires. It is the principle of the gentleman's agreement that has given birth or that gave birth to what is called the Oputa Panel. And before I go any further, I will give you a simple spoiler. It did not work. It did not work at all. Let's find out why. The Oputa Panel is also known as Nigeria's Human Rights Violation Investigation Commission. It was led by the legendary Chukwudifu Oputa, and it was developed following the collapse of military dictatorship in Nigeria in 1998. In fact, when it was created by the president, Olusegun Obasanjo, in 1999, the mandate was to investigate human rights abuses during the period of military rule from 1984 to 1999. But eventually, it was asked to even spread this to as far back as the Civil War, which began in 1966. In terms of reconciliation, the commission was also tasked with bringing together communities that had been estranged and had found themselves at loggerheads because of errors in state creation and in resource allocation. But this is not complete. We need to paint this picture a little better. After independence, after Nigeria gained our independence in 1960, there were many internal conflicts in Nigeria. And Nigeria could not really handle all of these at the time. We're a new government, a new people, we're still understanding our boundaries and our borders and the powers that had been taken from the British. This is one of the reasons that in less than a decade, there was a civil war. But more than a civil war, there were 5 military dictatorships. We had a cancelled election, and we had numerous human rights violations during these times. So, several people cried for justice. Several people said, this had been done to my community, this had been done to my state, this had been done to my people, to my tribe, to my religious sect. There were basically several echoes of we want a fair shake coming from different corners of Nigeria. Therefore, they set up a Human Rights Commission. And when the Human Rights Commission was set up, they gave them the simple job find out all the things that have happened, and then let us know how we can compensate, how we can communicate, and then how we can pay reparations if need be. This seems very simple, but ideas are often simple when you say them. Implementing them, however, is not so simple. And when it was time to implement this idea, there were two different challenges that existed. The first challenge was when the commission started its investigation, they could not hold on to their initial mandate. Like I said, the mandate was they were supposed to investigate from 1984 to 1999. But they realized that some of the problems that existed in 1984 and 1985 and 1986 were problems that started in 1965 and 1966 and 1979. Therefore, they had to stretch it further back to the beginning of Nigeria's problem, which they believed was 1960. There was also another problem. The committee or the commission was asked to reconcile many of the problems that occurred under military rule. However, these problems had spawned. They had changed from problems with the military or problems with military administrations to problems between two different tribes or problems between two different peoples or two different ethnicities. Basically, the problems had been allowed to fester for too long, and it had borne terrible fruit. So, the members of the panel decided to come up with techniques in order to solve these. And so they came with a process. The process had a few steps. First of all, they would acquire the information about the human rights violations through recollections and victim testimony. Then bring to light the identity of the people who they found to have committed a lot of these atrocities, and bring them to also give their own testimony and get them to either accept or deny the allegations against them. Then, when they got enough understanding and established the crimes that had been committed, they would give background to these crimes, give a face to these issues, and explain how they intended to go about solving them. This seemed like it was going well on paper. And so the commission came together, they made their findings, they made their recommendations, and they said some of them out loud. For example, they reported that the military control over Nigeria's politics is one of the worst things that happened to Nigeria, and that many of the human rights violations and the economic and political and social troubles that Nigeria went through is because the military did not allow Nigeria's democracy to flourish. That sounds like a given. Anybody could have thought that up. The commission also found out that many of the people in positions of power who were part of the military, and not even people who were in the military, always seemed to be there to work together when it was time to disrupt power at the center, when it was time to organize a coup, when it was time to seize power, when it was time to chase away an unpopular leader. The elites would come together and they would work together despite their religion, their ethnicity, their tribe. It did not matter at that time. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of the people listening to this. The commission also found out that the Ministry of Justice played a role in protecting a lot of the people who were guilty of many of these crimes. Then the commission recommended that a lot of Nigerians had to be paid reparations. They also recommended that corruption was one of Nigeria's biggest problems and therefore had to be eliminated. and that corruption in the government, in the civil service particularly, would be Nigeria's undoing. But at this point, let me stop and ask, these things I've said, as the recommendations and the findings and the conclusions from the report, where did I get them from? How am I so sure? In other words, where is the report? I know that sounds like a funny question, but I'll ask it again. Where is the report of the Oputa Panel? Surely it exists. They published something, they wrote something down, and they gave it to the government. So it exists. Yes, it does. But Nigeria being Nigeria, you can't find it. Well, I should not give my limitations to you, but you would not find a copy of the Oputa Panel's report to the Nigerian government anywhere online, for example. You would not find a PDF, you would not find a Word file, you would not find a library that has it. What you would find is an NGO here and an organization there that seem to have redacted copies of the report, but not the full thing. So the next question is, why? We'll tell you why. You see, when the panel finished and decided to prepare their report, two former military leaders who were against the commission went to the Nigerian court and challenged the commission's right to publish its report. Their argument was that the power to hold public hearings lies with the state governments of Nigeria, and therefore the federal government did not have the right to set up an investigatory panel. That is nonsense. I'm sorry I had to use that language, but for want of a better word, that's nonsense. It is nonsense. First of all, it was not a law court. Your testimony there was not something that was going to sentence you to jail. Your testimony there was given because you had previously admitted that you wanted to be involved in reconciliation and mending the fences that had broken Nigeria apart. So technically, you were voluntarily summoned to give your testimony. You could have gotten on the stand and decided not to say anything, but you went over there and you spoke, and then they challenged it. But looking from their point of view, there was a lot that was said at the Oputa panel. A lot was put forth. As a matter of fact, one of the more sensational stories that came out from there was the testimony of one Sergeant Rogers, where he came out and spoke candidly and talked about the missions, the orders, and how they carried out many of the atrocities that occurred in the early 90s. Eventually, the Supreme Court agreed with this argument, and therefore, the public did not get to see the Oputa Panel's report. There was an activist group, Nigerian Democratic Movement, who found a way to get the report and publish it online. And then there was a Nigerian-based civil society forum, which also got its hands on the report. And therefore, since they published it online, it was in the public realm. But mind you, this was 2005. And I do not know how many of us remember what 2005 was like, but the online culture in Nigeria in 2005 was not the richest. At the time, most people still used cyber cafes. Most of the phones we used were Symbian, which meant that many of us did not even have access to the internet on our phones. And whenever we got the chance to go to use computers, we're not going there to look for news. By my recollection and my investigation, newspapers did not publish the report, which is curious. Therefore, right now, state governments in Nigeria, out of their frustration of not having the report themselves, decided to set up their own truth and reconciliation commissions in order to answer some of the questions that were brought up during the Oputa panel. Now, the interesting thing about the Oputa panel is, while it was going on, it was an amazing show. First of all, it was an amazing show because of the people that were involved. Many of the names that you heard and you feared in Nigeria's history would come up to the stand and talk, and people like Femi Falana would question them, and they would laugh sometimes, and they would make snide comments, and then they would make quib remarks. But mostly it was a serious affair, and there was a grand nature to it. Also, it was right in our TV set. Around that time, NTA was one of the only stations that carried it live. And NTA would show the Oputa panel report from when it started at 9 in the morning, going down until about 3 in the afternoon. And it would be shouting matches back and forth, asking, why did you do this? Who did you do this for? Why did you not come forward earlier? Have you told this to these people? And have they heard? And it was one of those things that when you watched at the time, you would not believe that it would lead to nothing. Spoiler, it led to nothing. In fact, when the final report was given to President Obasanjo in 2002, everybody waited for it to be published, and it wasn't published. Some of the excerpts of it were given to certain state governments, like the Ogun state government, and they used it to have discussions with the people of Morocco. Some of it was given to the River State government so that they could help the people in Ogoni. But by and large, with what we saw, with the questions that were answered, with the revelations that were made, we know that there is a lot that should have come out of that exercise that did not come out of that exercise. And therefore, we wonder, why do we not have these things? We should have these things. This now brings us to the legacy of this event, because 1999, when the Oputa panel sat, was not the last time that terrible things happened in Nigeria. In fact, President Olusegun Obasanjo presided over one of the most chaotic 8 years in Nigeria's history. A lot of terrible things occurred during that time. One of them, which we have spoken about on this podcast, is the Zakibia massacre. And when it happened, in line with the Oputa panel, the Justice Okechukwu Opene panel was constituted. That also did not lead to much. However, it led to more than the Oputa panel. For one, that panel actually recommended compensation to the victims. When the OD massacre happened, there was no civilian panel constituted, but the Nigerian military set up a panel of inquiry and of reconciliation, and they also did come up with reparations. But think about what would have happened if the Oputa panel worked in the way that we expected it to have worked. Here's the picture. The Oputa panel occurred. People came, gave their testimony, spoke the truth, and exposed the terrible things that had happened in Nigeria for 40 years. Then they took the report, published it, and explained the people who were owed reparations, the people who were owed consolation, and what Nigeria had to do in order to further our democracy and not leave anybody behind. For example, I am of the opinion that Nigeria owes a large chest of reparations to the eastern part of this country for the Nigerian Civil War. The Oputa panel had discussions on things like this. We don't have to report. I am of the opinion that the clashes that occurred in the 90s and in the 80s in the middle belt of Nigeria and the northern part of Nigeria and in the south requires a lot of revelation and compensation to be given to the victims, many of whom are still alive today. The Oputa panel covered some of these, and we don't have them to see. I should not be telling you that I do not have the Oputa panel. It is a failure on my part that I cannot provide you with the document, or I cannot provide a link to say if you go here, you should find the Oputa panel. What I can tell you is that I will continue to try. And for those of you who watch this episode, continue to look here. And one day we will find the Oputa panel report. We shall publish the Oputa panel report, and we shall see what really it is that Nigeria has been running away from. This podcast, exists not just because we want to romanticize events that have happened in Nigeria's history. No. We also want to criticize. We want to summarize. We want to see our past mistakes, explain how crucial they were, and find out how long we have come, either on the wrong path or on the right path. The Oputa panel is one of the stories that we have that demonstrates what this podcast is trying to do. It was a forum where they called the big players in Nigeria's history and asked them, what was your role in A, in B, and C? And without the fear of retaliation or punishment or punitive damages, they were allowed to say that under orders, I did this, and under compulsion, I had to do this, and of my own free will, I also did that. The combination of all that information is richer than any kind of analysis that could have been done by an international organization somewhere or an NGO trying to dig up years later. This is a missed opportunity. And at the end of this show, where we are now, we must have these questions ready so that we can ask them to the Nigerian government and to ourselves. Why do we not have the report? Why have the evildoers not been prosecuted? And if they have not been prosecuted, will they ever be prosecuted? Why have the victims not been compensated? Will they ever be compensated? And why have the lessons not been learned? All these questions have one simple answer: because we don't have the report. That's why. As long as you do not have the report, you have nothing to stand on. The many panels and the commissions and the inquiries and investigations and recommendations can be boiled up into a whole lot of hopelessness for Nigeria. I imagine people of several communities who were watching the Oputa Panel and listening to the atrocities that were committed against them and thinking to themselves, oh, finally, we get justice. And now, it is a thing of history. I imagine people whose families were torn apart by the injustices of several administrations, thinking to themselves, now we can be vindicated, but they have nothing to show for it. I imagine a country where the average person has no real idea how terrible and devastating certain years of conflict and strife and hunger and starvation must have been to one of our largest nationalities and ethnic groups. I imagine as a people, we must do better. The hope is that with a podcast like this and other platforms like the one we have here, we can bring together these pieces and solve the puzzle that is Nigeria's hidden history. It may seem scary, but only good can come from the truth. Only good can come from the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Oputa Panel on the Fhtf Rhtr podcast. Make sure you like, make sure you share, make sure you subscribe. Next time.